Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're getting into Robert Kiyosaki's 2022 book, Capitalist Manifesto.
Right. So when you, our listeners, shared some excerpts with us.
Exactly. And our mission really is to pull out the main insights, the core arguments from these pieces you sent.
Without getting totally lost in the weeds, hopefully, give a clear picture of his key ideas.
Yeah, sort of a shortcut to his thinking in this book, which makes some pretty surprising connections at times.
It definitely does. And it kicks off with, well, quite a statement, doesn't it? Si vis pacem, para bellum.
If you want peace, prepare for war. Sets a certain tone right from the start.
It really does. And he asks that question directly, why write this book right now?
And his answer touches on a whole range of concerns. Things like censorship, what he terms cancel culture,
Critical race theory, the defund the police movement. It's quite a list.
rewriting history, media deplatforming. He sees these as, well, pretty significant issues.
So he's framing this book as a kind of response, a defense against what he sees as threats.
Threats to freedom, specifically, he makes that very clear. This isn't just Rich Dad, Poor Dad, Part 2.
No, he stresses that this goes beyond just money. He asks that fundamental question,
What's more important than money?
and his answer is freedom, capital F.
That really is the foundation. He even talks about the pushback he got early on with Rich Dad, Poor Dad. Right?
Oh, yeah. How the New York publishers initially rejected it because they just couldn't get behind his rich dad's lessons.
Lessons like, the rich don't work for money.
Your house isn't an asset, not a way people think.
And savers are losers. Still pretty controversial ideas for many people.
Definitely. Ideas that challenge conventional financial wisdom.
And he mentions the Cash Flow board game, launched way back in '96.
As a tool, right, for teaching what he calls real financial education. He sees it as really central.
So for him, the game isn't just a game, it's a deliberate teaching method, a way to grasp these concepts hands-on.
Exactly. Cash flow, assets, liabilities. The stuff he felt was missing from regular schooling, which leads into his wider view of society.
Yeah, he brings in these warnings from history, like Khrushchev.
Right, the quote about Americans being so gullible they'd accept communism bit by bit.
And Edmund Burke, the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. Standard, but powerful in this context.
He's using these to urge vigilance, essentially, a wake-up call.
He also quotes Washington on free speech.
Saying if it's taken away, we're like sheep led to slaughter.
Yeah.
Dumb and silent.
And even Karl Marx, warning about communists forcibly overthrowing things.
It's a whole collection of historical voices warning about losing liberty.
And he connects this history to today using that 2020 poll.
The Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation won. Showing, 40% of Americans having a favorable view of socialism?
Yeah, up from 36% the year before, with higher numbers among millennials and Gen Z.
And he contrasts that with a slight dip in positive views of capitalism. Yeah. He presents this data as, evidence.
Evidence that the ideas he's opposing might be gaining ground.
It's an interesting interpretation. He also notes that stat about Americans prioritizing freedom over safety in 2020, a potential tension there.
Which leads him to ask the reader directly, are you a socialist, Marxist, fascist, communist, capitalist?
A direct challenge to self-identify, to really think about where you stand.
And he states the book's purpose pretty clearly in response to all this.
That the best way to counter what he sees as communism in schools is to teach capitalism at home.
Setting the stage for his critique of education and his whole approach.
He then gets quite personal, talking about leaving Vietnam in '73.
Right, and connecting Khrushchev's warning to his own generation's experience. He felt it was happening.
And he contrasts the protesters back home with the Marines he served with. Two very different realities.
Then there's the classic contrast between his two dads' advice.
His poor dad, go to school, get a job, work hard, the traditional path.
Versus his rich dad. Get a job, learning to sell, learn to be an entrepreneur.
That fundamental difference in mindset is just core to everything Kiyosaki teaches, isn't it?
Absolutely. And that divergence led him, with Kim, to create the Cash Flow game.
Which he explicitly calls a capitalist tool.
Designed, in his view, specifically to combat communist ideas he thought were being taught in schools.
It's fascinating, the game as an ideological counterweapon, almost.
He also mentions King's Point, joining the Marines specifically to fight Marxists in Vietnam. Those were formative experiences.
Clearly shaped his worldview. Then he throws in some more stark quotes.
Stalin, about who counts the votes.
Chilling. And Hitler, on how fortunate governments are that people don't think.
These are meant to warn against apathy, against blindly following.
Definitely. He then targets the National Education Association, the NEA.
Describes it as the biggest teachers union, and cites a Forbes piece that's highly critical.
Yeah, calling it a bare-knuckles labor union, serving its own interests, contributing to educational decline. That's a direct criticism of a major institution.
A very strong claim, and he backs it with quotes from Marx, Lenin, Stalin on education as a tool for shaping minds ideologically.
Reinforcing his fear that the system might be promoting ideas he opposes.
Then there's that personal story about seeing an A-bomb test in '62.
Wow. Talk about illustrating the Cold War context he grew up in. That must have had a huge impact.
Yeah, you'd think so. He then shifts to more recent stuff, student dropout rates during the pandemic, student debt.
Tapping into current anxieties.
Yeah.
And he brings in Buckminster Fuller here.
Ah, yes, Bucky Fuller. With the observation, they're playing games with money, especially regarding bailouts.
Where the public ends up covering the bankers' losses. Fuller's influence starts showing up here.
Kiyosaki also flags the huge rise in federal student loan debt, another burden,
Which sort of transitions into his discussion of Black Lives Matter.
which he approaches, well, very directly. He says he supports free speech.
But disagrees with the ideology, quoting a founder saying, "We are trained Marxists." He also mentions the All Lives Matter response and the dictionary definition of racism.
He's clearly viewing these movements through his specific ideological lens. It's important for listeners to remember this is his interpretation.
Absolutely. He then discusses the 1619 Project.
Describing it as an attempt to reframe U.S. history around slavery, which he suggests aligns with Marxist analysis. Again, a viewpoint that's heavily debated.
Very much so. He then adds his own family history, Japanese Americans interned during WWII.
Contrasting that experience with discussions about reparations for slavery, he includes a quote from Candace Owens on this point, too.
Questioning the focus. And he uses the Manhattan Purchase example, 24 large then, trillions now, to challenge the concept of historical reparations based on past valuations.
It's a complex and, frankly, sensitive area he wades into there.
He then pivots back to mindset, quoting his rich dad again.
I can't afford it, closes the mind.
Whereas, how can I afford it, opens the mind to learning and possibilities. That's a core Kiyosaki principle.
He also mentions his own struggles in school, especially English, and his dad's views on education's cost versus value.
Provides some personal context for his later critiques. And he includes Frost's The Road Not Taken.
Maybe reflecting his own choice to go to Kings Point, not the University of Hawaii.
Embracing values like mission, honor, discipline, respect, duty. That sets up the next section on teachers.
Right. Great teachers. Starts with the Merchant Marine Academy motto, acta non verba.
Deeds, not words. That really signals his preference for practical experience.
He talks about Hell Week at Kings Point, emphasizing the toughness.
And how his teachers there, many with real-world backgrounds, were real teachers in his book because they'd done things.
Experience is key for him. He then mentions his own experiences in Vietnam, the Tet Offensive, My Lai.
Horrific events that clearly shaped his views on war, leadership, and importantly, media narratives.
His decision to leave Standard Oil to teach economics at Kings Point, inspired by his rich dad.
Shows his commitment to spreading that capitalist mindset, doesn't it?
Definitely. He then introduces his idea of four intelligences: mental, physical, emotional, spiritual.
Arguing that schools focus too much on the mental, on memorization, neglecting learning through doing and feeling.
Which he sees as a major flaw. School teachers are poor teachers, in that sense, he argues.
Because true understanding comes from activity, which brings him back, again, to the cash flow game.
As a tool for teaching financial intelligence and capitalism, hands-on.
Contrasting it with schools, which he controversially claims teach communism and communist principles. That's a very pointed statement.
He uses Maria Montessori quotes to back this up. Growth comes from activity. What the hand does, the mind remembers.
Supporting that experiential learning philosophy baked into the game.
And he talks about fear, false evidence appearing real.
Suggesting traditional education instills a fear of mistakes, which cripples financial literacy and risk-taking.
Keeps people stuck, maybe, in that employee mindset he critiques, which leads to a really provocative question.
Who killed the most people? Capitalism versus communism? Wow.
Yeah, it's stark. He prefaces it with stories from his time flying helicopters in Vietnam, the CH-46, the Huey gunship.
Describing the dangers, flying in formation, the threat of the SA-7 missile, giving context to his perspective on conflict.
These are visceral first-hand accounts. He talks about the Battle of Hue during Tet.
and the disconnect between the fighting they experienced and how it was reported back home.
His co-pilot asking what happened after the press reported victory amidst devastation. That's skepticism towards official narratives again.
Right, and his economics teacher using the Charge of the Light Brigade poem.
To illustrate miscommunication, bad leadership, drawing parallels to Vietnam, using history to understand the present.
He then discusses toxic masculinity, linking it to Marx and feminism, followed by that slightly odd pop quiz on types of men.
Nice guys, bad boys, wimps, it's direct.
It is. But it leads into the chapter's main point, asking who killed more people, socialists, capitalists, or Marxists.
And he cites the Black Book of Communism.
With its estimate of up to 100 million deaths under communist regimes, he breaks down the numbers: China, Soviet Union.
65 million in China, 20 million in the Soviet Union, millions more elsewhere. The scale is just staggering.
Truly horrifying. He compares these numbers to deaths caused by the Nazis in Imperial Japan,
placing communist regimes within that context of 20th century mass violence.
And he claims this truth is often avoided by the politically correct press, teachers, and politicians.
Which brings us to the next chapter. Where have all our heroes gone?
Starting with Christopher Reeve's definition of a hero, an ordinary person persevering against obstacles. Very human.
He recalls the assassinations, JFK, MLK, RFK, huge losses that shook the country.
Mentions the song Abraham, Martin, and John, reflecting that loss. Connects it to warnings from Scott McKenzie and Lincoln.
Mackenzie's whole generation with the new explanation, Lincoln's point about government philosophy being shaped in schools, that idea keeps coming back.
It does. A concern about societal direction, influenced by education. He then talks about people leaving California.
Citing rising crime, homelessness, paints a picture of decline.
Even mentioning the human feces incidents in San Francisco, a graphic detail to make a point about societal breakdown.
He references Orwell's Animal Farm equality, media power, seeing parallels today.
And he claims Khrushchev's 1959 warning basically came true in 2020, with kids living under a form of communism, in his view.
He points to censorship, Trump, big pharma critics, Bobby Kennedy Jr.'s vaccine skepticism, raising free speech concerns in the digital age.
Uses Ayn Rand on money as a societal barometer, Orwell on silencing dissent, reinforcing those themes.
He shares his experiences on shore patrol in the Philippines and Hong Kong,
offering gritty, first-hand perspective on the challenges of maintaining order.
Then he addresses George Floyd and the defund the police movement,
including quotes from figures like Omar, Tlaib, AOC. We should stress these are specific viewpoints in a very complex ongoing debate.
Absolutely. He also includes Trump's and Giuliani's perspectives on supporting police, presenting different sides there.
And he wraps up by returning to Reeve's definition of a hero needing perseverance in divided times.
Okay, next chapter. America's Poor Aristocrats. Starts with that Lenin quote.
Grind the bourgeoisie between taxation and inflation. Sets a tone about economic power dynamics.
He gives the basic Marxist class breakdown: aristocracy, bourgeoisie, proletariat.
Notes Marx's hatred of aristocrats, but points out the tyranny that often followed Marxist revolutions.
He talks about wealthy figures today, suggesting a new kind of poor aristocracy. Wealthy, maybe, but dependent or lacking true financial sense in his view.
Includes Candace Owens' take on Patrice Cullors as an unapologetic Marxist, adding to that mix of ideology and wealth.
Quotes Orwell again, some animals are more equal than others, applying it critically.
Then a whole string of quotes, Sowell, MLK, Voltaire, Douglas, Churchill, all championing free speech, a core value for him.
Then he makes a pretty bold historical claim
that the first stage of Marxism-Leninism in America began in 1913 with the Federal Reserve.
Wow. Yeah, that's a significant interpretation. He also links critical race theory to Marxist principles.
Circling back to his concerns about education and ideology.
He sees the canceling of July 4th fireworks at Mount Rushmore in 2021 as symbolic.
A move away from traditional symbols in his reading. Uses another Lenin quote, "One man with a gun can control 100 without one."
Highlighting dangers of centralized power, maybe hinting at self-reliance.
Which fits with his mention of Bitcoin and DeFi as reactions against that central control.
He points out Senator Elizabeth Warren's wealth, quotes her about needing a seat at the table, perhaps commenting on political influence.
Brings in Ayn Rand again, warning against compelled transactions versus voluntary ones, free market ethics.
Uses Thomas Sowell on politicians and ideological risks in education. Still worried about indoctrination.
And reminds us again why he created the Catch a Flag Up game in '96.
Because capitalism and financial literacy weren't being taught in schools, as he saw it.
Mentions the academic elite rejecting rich dad, poor dad initially, that divide between practical and academic views.
Briefly touches on the 2008 repo market crash, implicating the academic elite.
Cites Stephen Brill's book Tailspin on rising inequality and a changing aristocracy. Finds common ground there.
Talks about Brill's elite education Deerfield, Yale hinting at insulated circles.
Defines the repo market, its role in the shadow banking system. Complex stuff.
He touches on COVID origins, referencing Jim Rickard's concerns about biolabs, a more speculative point.
Includes that Lenin quote, "Medicine is the keystone in the arch of socialism." Cites Obamacare as government healthcare intervention.
And notes the repo market reversal in June 2021, maybe suggesting ongoing financial fragility. It's a packed chapter pulling lots of threads together.
It really is. Which brings us to the final section we're covering. What can I do? Buckminster Fuller's insight.
Okay, so this seems more solution-focused, drawing on Bucky Fuller.
Starts with Fuller's idea that squares lack integrity, aren't found in nature. Contrasts it with triangles.
Connects this to Plato saying opinion is the lowest form of knowledge, seeking deeper truths.
Fuller's emphasis on triangles as having structural integrity. He also brings in Maria Montessori's holistic view of education, spiritual development, universal context.
Introduces Fuller's building blocks of the universe, tetrahedron, octahedron, etc., and his big idea, synergetics.
That interconnected systems thinking approach. Kiyosaki shares personal stories about meeting Fuller.
Right, how much Fuller influenced him. Makes the ideas more accessible.
Recounts Fuller asking, "Do you think God would leave the area of circle to be unresolved?" And his response, "How dare we lie to our students?"
A passion for truth, for questioning assumptions. Fuller apparently saw the economy sinking in 2020, warned about ignoring fundamental principles.
That story about Fuller's daughter and the Harvard pennant illustrates life's unpredictability, right? Need for adaptability.
Fuller's own turning point in 1927, contemplating suicide, then deciding to experiment, to see what one individual could do for humanity. Powerful stuff.
And his definition of synergy is key. Behavior of whole systems unpredicted by the behavior of their parts. Interconnectedness.
Fuller realizing making money and making sense were often exclusive, shifting focus from profit to purpose.
Coining GRUNCH gross, universal cash heist, his critical view of the financial system, this influenced the cash flow game design with Kim.
He presents self-publishing Rich Dad Poor Dad in '97 as guided by Fuller's wisdom.
And sees Capitalist Manifesto as continuing that work, creating products to counter communist teachings, inspired by Fuller.
He does acknowledge criticisms of Fuller's life and work, which is fair.
Then revisits Fuller's critique of schools as non-synergetic, breaking knowledge into isolated facts, losing the whole picture.
Repeats the synergy definition. Fuller argued elementary school is boring because it dissects reality into unrelated subjects.
That idea of schools forced specialization. Fuller warned narrow focus, loses the big picture, the interconnectedness needed for real innovation.
Kiyosaki links this to his cash flow quadrant ESBI.
Saying Fuller believed schools program people to be brain slaves, employees, and self-employed, not B's or I's.
Fuller's idea was the warlord, the integrator, gains power by being general, while specialists, brain slaves, become limited.
Kiyosaki positions himself as a B and I real estate investor, entrepreneur, contrasting his path with the ES path from school.
And Fuller's answer to, what can a little guy do? That's powerful.
Do the things that need doing, that you see need doing, and that no one else seems to see need doing. A call to individual initiative.
Kiyosaki then includes some quotes from Pelosi and Hitler he finds concerning, though the link isn't fully spelled out.
References Gad Saad's idea pathogens in universities, back to the theme of harmful ideologies in education.
Repeats his rich dad's advice, be careful hiring educated Marxists.
Uses Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, warning about getting permission from non-producers. Skepticism of bureaucracy.
Expresses concerns about MMT and UBI as potential harmful economic trends.
Mentions Gad Saad again on the postmodernism pandemic attacking reason, linking postmodernism to Marxism.
Though, interestingly, Fuller himself disagreed with postmodernism's rejection of universal truths. So, some nuance there.
Kiyosaki's conclusion is that MMT and UBI lead to poverty and inequality.
He ends with Fuller's vision. We are called to be architects of the future, not its victims. Mentions Fuller's book, GRUN.
And reiterates the Rich Dad Company mission. Elevate financial well-being globally by providing tools and pathways.
His final take is that postmodern education lacks integrity and doesn't prepare people for the real world.
Wow. Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive into Kiyosaki's Capitalist Manifesto, We've definitely covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, his concerns about society, the push for financial education as a counter, and the huge influence of thinkers like Buckminster Fuller.
You can really see how he weaves together historical warnings, his own life stories, and his economic theories to build his case.
A case that's often provocative, sometimes controversial.
And that contrast he draws between traditional schooling and the capitalist education of something like the cash flow is just constant, isn't it?
Absolutely. And Fuller's whole synergetics idea offers this different lens for looking at learning and solving problems. Kiyosaki clearly values that perspective hugely.
For sure. But as you said, this is just scratching the surface. The book goes much deeper into all this.
Right. So for you, the listener, if this sparked your interest, exploring the full book or maybe digging into Buckminster Fuller's work could be really worthwhile.
Definitely. Which leads us to maybe a final thought to leave you with.
Given Kiyosaki's relentless focus on freedom and his critique of these big systems, education, finance,
What fundamental assumptions might you be holding about how the world works that maybe deserve a closer look, a bit more critical thought?